I'm Marshall Kosloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
On today's episode, I'm joined by Dmitri Alperovitch. He's the co-founder and chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. He has a new book out, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. This conversation is divided in two. In the short term, we focus on how the United States can deter China in the Indo-Pacific, specifically when it comes to Taiwan. We hit the defense, economic, and diplomatic aspects of the deterrence policy. But at a broader level, we talk about American national competitiveness, which is required to win the century itself in categories including defense, technology, economic growth, and everything that is contained therein.
And I argue that the stakes with China, with losing Taiwan, are so high that we need to do it all. We need to focus on military deterrence, but we also need to focus on economic and diplomatic deterrence to try to influence him as much as possible, create as many dilemmas for him as possible so that he wakes up every single day, Xi Jinping, looks at himself in the mirror as he's shaving and says, today is not the day.
Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Dmitri Alperovitch, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Great to be on with you.
Really great, and I'm glad to chat with you. So you've done a lot of media for World on the Brink, including my other podcast, The Realignment. For this conversation, I'd especially like to zoom in on the theme of this show, which is the Arsenal of Democracy, the defense industrial base, those quasi-domestic, quasi-international challenges we're facing. I'd love for you to relate World on the Brink to the theme of the show within that framework then.
Sure. Well, the defense industrial base is one of the big focus areas of the book because at the end of the day, the deterrence of Taiwan, the deterrence of invasion of Taiwan by China will be reliant on our ability to largely deter in the military domain. Yes, I argue we should pursue the economic deterrence, diplomatic deterrence, all that is really important. But at the end of the day, if you don't have the hard power to win and convince the Chinese that you can win, the other stuff is going to matter a lot less. And for that, we really need to learn the lessons of Ukraine. And the biggest lesson is that we need lots and lots of munitions. That quantity has a quality of its own. Unfortunately, over the last 4 decades, we have spent our time investing in really exquisite, highly capable weapons platforms that are way too expensive for us to afford in large quantities. And I highlight in the book that the Ford aircraft carrier is probably the poster child for that exuberance, because aircraft carriers are really, really important, I should say, from the outset. I don't think they're obsolete. Yes, they're more vulnerable today, perhaps, than they've been in the past, but they can be protected. It's still very hard to destroy them, even if you're China. But we've had the Nimitz-class aircraft carriers for decades that are head and shoulders above everyone else's. Better than China's, better than the French aircraft carrier, better than the British. Just absolutely an outstanding platform. But then we went to the Ford class, the next generation, and the cost difference is just astronomical. The Nimitz class cost us about $4 billion. The Ford class, almost 14. We did not get 3.5 times the value for our money. And particularly given that the Nimitz class was the best in the world, why do we need to spend that much more on the Ford class? And how many aircraft carriers can we buy at the price tag of $14 billion? You can go on and look at other platforms. Hypersonics are a great example. We're chasing hypersonics because the Chinese are chasing them. Well, the reality is when you're procuring missiles at a cost of $60 million per missile, how many of them can you realistically afford to buy? And how many targets are you going to find that are worth destroying $60 million worth of munitions?
You know, I'm glad you started there because one of my colleagues, Dr. Nadia Shadlow, also does a lot of work with you. And a theme of our recent conversations on this podcast has been the need to translate policy consensus into actual action. And you are the chairman of something called the Silverado Policy Accelerator. So I'll take that title very, very literally in this case. You reference this need to transition from these exquisite systems more to mass. And I think ever since Christian Burroughs of Anduril wrote The Kill Chain a few years ago, as a podcast host, you're also a podcast host, everyone likes saying we need to end this focus on these exquisite systems. So we all agree. How do we translate this policy consensus into actual action? Because I don't want to be in a scenario where we're just hearing this point 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now.
Well, we need to push back on these incredibly expensive platforms, and hypersonics are a great example. Look, hypersonics can one day be really transformational, and the ability to navigate at high speeds with a warhead and the ability to potentially penetrate air defenses is really, really cool. But at $60 million a shot, it's simply not worth it, because you know what else can penetrate air defenses? A ton of conventional munitions that cost a lot less, right? So Tomahawk missile, our conventional munition, costs about $2 million, right? So a 30x difference. You know what? 10 or 15 Tomahawks can penetrate most air defense sites by just overwhelming them. And you're still at half the cost of one hypersonic. Now, I'm all in favor of continuing to do research, finding ways to reduce costs over time, but don't procure them in large quantities at these huge price tags right now. We need to encourage investments in low-cost munitions. So right now, the Air Force has a really interesting project to look at buying long-range cruise missiles designs from places like Anduril and others at a cost of about $150,000. That's a reasonable price tag for a missile and will allow you to buy tens of thousands of them at a reasonable cost that you need to overwhelm a lot of targets. We need to be doing a lot more of that. I'm not in favor of increasing the defense budget. Look, at $900 billion a year, which is what we're spending on our military today, you can't really afford to spend much more given that you have $35 trillion in debt. What we need to do is spend that money smarter. Now, a lot of that money is actually not going to weapon systems. A lot of it is personnel costs and healthcare costs, but a huge chunk of it still is. And we need to focus, and we need to make sure that we're not wasting all this money on Ford-class aircraft carriers, on hypersonic missiles, and other platforms that we can no longer afford.
I'm curious, what has the war in Ukraine taught you about the difference between technological innovation and exquisite futuristic systems and just bare minimum need to have, there are problems on the battlefield that need to be solved today? How has what you've seen over the past 2 years instructed your thoughts on that?
Well, the first thing is that there's no such thing as a wonder weapon, right? We've gone through these iterations where people were celebrating ATACMS or HIMARS before them, or Leopard tanks and Bradley vehicles, and saying, oh my God, this is going to be the game changer. This is what's going to help Ukraine win this war. And the reality is, it's not that. It's the ability to use smart tactics, train force with, guess what? Artillery, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Yes, all of those things, long-range fires and precision-guided munitions are very, very helpful, but they are not sufficient to win wars. And what you need more than anything is mass, particularly when you're facing a great power in a conflict that can go on for many years, because you're going to be out of everything very, very quickly, particularly if those things cost, tens of millions of dollars. So being able to find the sweet spot between capability and cost is going to be absolutely essential to determining the future of warfare.
That's very helpful. So you actually set up, I think, the dynamics of your book very well, in that we just did a very zoomed in focus area on the U.S. domestic production capacity with then 2 theaters, Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, and then Eastern Europe, Ukraine. But the book broadly, though, is about how America can beat China in the race for the 21st century. And those 2 theaters that I just described are very much 2020s, 2030s, knock on wood, parts of this dynamic. But if we're going to tell a story of the 20th century, this would be kind of like focusing on, let's say, the war in Spain, or focusing on World War I, which were obviously incredibly consequential, but that misses the rest of the century. So can you kind of zoom out and articulate how you kind of distinguish between these very in-our-face conflicts and dangers with this broader metric of trying to win the 21st century itself?
Well, look, I do think that we need to focus and prioritize. And the number one threat to American dominance of this century is China. It is not Russia. It is not Iran. It is North Korea. Now, I'm not arguing that we shouldn't ignore these threats. Clearly, we have global interests and global priorities, but we need to make sure that we take care of number one problem first, which is China, right? Making sure that we don't get into a disastrous conflict with China over Taiwan that will destroy the global economy, that risks nuclear escalation, that if China wins it, will let it dominate East Asia, and from there expand influence across the world. So we have to deter that at all costs. That needs to be priority 1, 2, and 3. After we've taken care of that, we can focus on other areas. But that means asking our allies to step up, particularly in Europe, particularly with Ukraine, and letting them know that, yes, we're going to provide capabilities as much as we can, but they need to do their part a lot more than they have up to this point.
That's well said. And I guess if we're stack ranking the threats, obviously China is far ahead of Russia, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. But obviously a dynamic that's emerged during the war in Ukraine and likely, I think, has to play into our calculations when we're thinking of deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is the clear intermingling between the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, North Koreans, et cetera, when it comes to production, when it comes to technology transfers, et cetera. How do you think we can prioritize China while also recognizing a degree of entanglement between their own allies?
Well, look, we have to appreciate that these regimes are cooperating not out of enormous love for one another, but because it's transactional, right? Iran is supplying drones and missiles to Russia. What is it getting in return? Gold and probably various technology capabilities. North Korea is supplying missiles and artillery ammunition to Russia. It is getting back probably cash, but also we know technology transfers, particularly in the missile development phases. China is doing anything that's good for China. It is not willing to lift a finger to help Russia unless it's good for them. So we have to not overstate the level of entanglement that you have between these countries and how much of what they're doing is really in the pursuit of self-interest. But I do think that we need to define our objectives with each country, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and they're different. I think we've been meandering for a long time, particularly with regards to Iran and North Korea, and letting, I would say, the nuclear portfolio, particularly when it comes to North Korea, overshadow everything. Well, the reality is that North Korea has been a nuclear power for almost 2 decades, right? The first acquired nuclear weapons and tested them in the 2000s, mid-2000s. And they now have not only, conventional nuclear weapons, they have a hydrogen bomb as well. They have multiple ways to deliver them. They're not going back, right? They're not denuclearizing in any foreseeable future, certainly not until there is a regime change and maybe not even then. So the idea that we would continue to focus our foreign policy on trying to get the North Koreans to pull back and destroy so many of their nuclear weapons, which has never happened in history. Like no one who has had that many nuclear warheads and operational control of them has ever relinquished them, right? In the case of Ukraine and Kazakhstan, they did have nuclear weapons, but they were under the control of Moscow when they gave them up in the 90s. South Africa is probably the only one that has built a few nuclear warheads and ultimately relinquished them when in the late 80s, early 90s, and destroyed them basically. But not on the scale of North Korea. So we need to figure out, okay, if we're not going to get them to denuclearize, what it is that we want to actually achieve with the North Koreans. And I would argue containment. I would argue that we need to prevent them from threatening South Korea. We need to prevent them from proliferating that technology to other countries, particularly in the nuclear realm. And if we do that, that's not a victory, but it's enough for us to manage the problem, right? And focus our attention on China. Similarly with Russia, with Iran, we need to get back to the basics and ask the fundamental question, what is the minimum bar for success? How do we achieve that with minimal resources while we're dedicating most of our focus on winning the Cold War with China?
I think if you really look at what folks both inside and outside the Biden administration would argue, everyone has their own version of saying that they agree with what you just said. So how should we measure whether or not any administration, left, right, or center, et cetera, is actually prioritizing, is actually identifying the difference between the nice to haves and the need to haves? How should we measure these statements?
Well, we should measure them by action and actually see, is the majority of the DoD budget going to the Indo-Pacific? That's a pretty easy thing to evaluate. Is it going to the platforms that we need to deter China from invading Taiwan? And the answer to that is clearly right now, no. There are a lot of things that are happening. I don't want to diminish that. And Indo-PACOM is getting quite a bit of capabilities, but we're not prioritizing it as much as we should. We're not investing enough in shipbuilding and submarine building as we should. We've made some progress in that area, and AUKUS in particular is an innovative way to try to fund this, particularly with allied dollars, namely the Australians, to increase our shipyard capacity for producing attack submarines. But we need to do much, much more. And instead, what are we doing? Well, we're investing in developing icebreakers for the Arctic. Look, I'd love for us to be able to dominate the Arctic, but it's not a priority. And we only have so much money. And we have to find a way to prioritize that limited pot of money, given the amount of debt that we have, on the top problem.
If you're looking at what you said at the start of the episode, you pointed out that deterrence is key when it comes to China and Taiwan. You mentioned that obviously we have a defense focused deterrence, but there's also economic and diplomatic deterrence. What is that side of the strategy? What do those two sides of the strategy look like to you?
Yeah. So here's the problem with deterrence, right? At the end of the day, it's fundamentally unmeasurable because all you're doing is trying to influence the mind of one person, Xi Jinping. And you don't know what's going to work, right? And in other areas of deterrence, namely the nuclear one, where we've confronted this challenge of trying to avoid a catastrophic result in nuclear war, what we've done is we've gone for overkill, right? You could say, for example, that having about 400 ICBM missiles sitting in silos across the Midwest is sufficient to deter anyone from striking the United States, right? It's so many missiles, you can't possibly strike them all and overwhelm them. We have early warning radar. That's good enough. We don't do that. We say we're going to have those missiles, but we're also going to invest in very, very expensive capabilities to launch missiles off nuclear submarines. We're going to invest in bomber capabilities to get through air defenses and launch nuclear weapons, right? All of those things to have that nuclear triad is incredibly expensive to do, is very involved, but we say the risks are so high of a accidental or a determined nuclear strike that we're going to do it all. Everything that we can possibly can to send a message to our adversaries that if you strike us, we will destroy you, right? And I argue that the stakes with China, with losing Taiwan, are so high that we need to do it all. We need to focus on military deterrence, but we also need to focus on economic and diplomatic deterrence to try to influence him as much as possible and create as many dilemmas for him as possible so that he wakes up every single day, Xi Jinping, looks at himself in the mirror as he's shaving and says, today is not the day, right? In the economic sphere, that means we need more leverage. We need to send a message to him that if he goes for Taiwan, regardless of whether he thinks we're going to intervene or not, that there's going to be enormous repercussions, economic repercussions for China. He should look at what's happened to Russia in terms of sanctions and export controls that we've instituted in the Russian economy. And he should think, wow, if they do that to me, that would be really bad, because the one thing that Russia has is China to help them out, to provide them with black market goods and help them evade these export controls. Well, China won't have a China to save it, right? There's no one that has the capacity of China to provide as many black market goods as an economy needs. So to do that, we need to engage in what I call in the book unidirectional entanglement. Basically create this asymmetric dependence where we'll bring China closer to us and make them more dependent on us in areas like semiconductors and artificial intelligence and biotech and the like. And we make us less dependent on them in areas like critical minerals, where they are responsible for 90% of the world's processing and refining, in areas like green energy, where they're trying to dominate the EV space, the battery space, wind and solar, and so forth.
How do you make China more dependent on us for these critical tech categories where they themselves have clearly been aggressively investing in their own plans?
Well, you have to look at technology by technology, and it all starts with semiconductors because you can't build anything without chips, right? And we have unbelievable leverage in the semiconductor space because the equipment that you use to manufacture chips at any node, whether it's advanced nodes or foundational nodes, the so-called 20 nanometers and above nodes, is manufactured in 3 countries. It is manufactured in the US, it is manufactured in the Netherlands, and it's manufactured in Japan. And by the way, even with the Dutch and the Japanese, the technology that goes into the manufacturing of those equipment is based on US IP, which we can control through something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule that the Commerce Department wields, where it basically says that if you have about 20% of US IP content in your product, we have global jurisdiction of where it gets exported. We can tell any country in the world to prevent it from exporting to any other country in the world. In fact, that's what we did with Russia when we instituted export controls on semiconductors to Russia, any semiconductors, because they're all designed and produced with US equipment or US technology, US designs, and the like. So we can do that to China. We can cut them off from ability to import this equipment, which is the most sophisticated equipment man has ever built, right, to manufacture these chips at incredible distances between transistors that are thinner than a human hair. And we can prevent them from manufacturing their own chips, which means that they will have to import chips from Taiwan, from Korea, from Japan, from us, and so forth. That gives us leverage, right? Could they figure this out eventually? Could they build that equipment? Probably. It's very, very difficult. It'll probably take them a decade or longer to do so, which gives us time, right? Which potentially takes us past Xi Jinping's term in power. Who knows who would come next? But buying time is the name of the game here. So the more you can do that, the better off you are. And by the way, as they're figuring this out, we're advancing. We're not staying still. So we'll be even further ahead while they're trying to do the basics. In AI, we've done a lot to prevent them from buying advanced chips, which you need to train AI models, right? And it's not an accident that the leading companies right now that are building these foundation models are all in the US or one in Europe with Mistral. None of them are in China. The Chinese are very far behind because they've not been able to procure NVIDIA and AMD chips, the GPUs you need to train AI models. So we have a lot of leverage. We just need to use it to make sure that they remain dependent on us in a lot of these technologies.
The next question, and this is pretty implicit in this conversation, but I want to make it very explicit. Deterrence is a strategy that we're employing, obviously, when it comes to Taiwan. It's what we employed when it came to Eastern, Central Europe, and obviously Berlin during the Cold War. But deterrence itself is different than, let's say, the broader policy of containment, which is how we won the Cold War. So how would you distinguish, when you're thinking of the 21st century, our short to medium term need to deter an invasion of Taiwan itself in the way that we failed to deter an invasion of Ukraine, from the need to have a broader strategy to actually win the century itself?
Absolutely. And this is a 2-part strategy for victory that I describe in World on the Brink, because it begins with deterring an invasion of Taiwan. And the reason why Taiwan is so important is that it's actually fundamental to containing China. Geographically containing them, economically containing them, preventing them from dominating Asia, because Taiwan is that anchor point in the first island chain that keeps them bottled up. If they escape, and if you look at the map, which I have in the book, of China, you can see their dilemmas. They see themselves as completely surrounded by U.S. military bases and U.S. allies, right? From the east, you have the Korean Peninsula, half of which is South Korea, with 28,000 American troops, air bases, radar installations, and the like. Then you have the Japanese islands, the headquarters of the 7th Fleet, Marines on Okinawa, enormous capabilities there. Taiwan, at the very center, facing the Taiwan Straits. Most of the Chinese ports are very near to Taiwan, within about 1,000-mile range, viewed as an outpost of American power. And then closing that arc are the Philippines, which, of course, we are re-engaging with, and where, for the first time in 30 years, American troops are back accessing Filipino military bases, right? Really, really important, because the waters on the Chinese shoreline are very shallow in South China Sea and in East China Sea. In fact, in the Taiwan Strait, the waters are about only 300 feet deep. On the other side of Taiwan, on its eastern part, they drop to 12,000 feet and then go down even further. The Pacific is the deepest ocean in the world. So by being able to take Taiwan, you're able to escape out of that containment and project your naval power across the Pacific, kick the U.S. out of that region, and dominate it. Dominate the security order of that region, dominate the economic order, and then use that as a base to project power elsewhere. So deterring that invasion of Taiwan is step one and is important for containing China. But then if you do that, you start looking at ways that you win the century on the economic front. Because as long as we remain the dominant economy in the world, we'll maintain our military edge because we'll be able to outspend the Chinese on military systems, particularly if we do it smarter than the way we're doing today. And if you look at what's going on with the Chinese economy, it's a complete train wreck. They've gone out of the days of double-digit growth. The real growth is about 2.5%, 3% today, about equal to ours. But we're 25% bigger, which means that unless something drastically changes on their end or our end, they're never going to catch up with us, which gives us an incredible advantage. And particularly if we dominate the 4 critical technologies of the century, AI and autonomy, biotech and synthetic biology, aerospace and green energy, and the 2 components that go into building those technologies, semiconductors and critical minerals, this will be our century, and we can wait them out, particularly with the demographic problems that they're going to have later in the century.
So for the final question here, something that guests and listeners appreciate about Arsenal of Democracy is it's very pragmatically focused. It's very much centered around identifying problems that need to be solved with a real motivated bit of aggression there. What are, and you don't have to have an answer to the solution to these problems, but what are just some problems that you've encountered studying and working in this space that you think folks who do this work for a living should be thinking about when it comes to answering these broader strategic objectives we have?
Well, I think it starts with the understanding of what the problem is, right? And I think we're still in this town largely trying to avoid the label of the Cold War II, as I call it, on this relationship with China. And I think it's a huge mistake. As I write in the book, we're unquestionably in a Cold War, and it's time to call a spade, because if you don't do that, then you get yourself tangled up in these contradictions of, well, are we competing with China? Are we cooperating with them? What takes precedent? Which side are we going to err on when we're trying to come up with these policies on export controls on semiconductor equipment or tariffs on their goods and the like? And if you're in a Cold War, it's pretty clear. The goal is victory, right? And as the saying goes, the main thing is to keep the main thing. And we got to have that focus and that clarity of vision of what conflict we're in. And then it becomes a lot easier to advocate for a lot of these policies.
No, that's very well stated, especially when, oftentimes the competition language isn't strategically clarifying enough because we compete with the Europeans in a variety of categories, including some of the tech categories you described earlier in the show, but that competition doesn't have the same level of stakes as it does when it actually comes to the China context. So being clear about the nature of what's actually happening is very clarifying. So Dmitri,
this is not the Olympics, right? This is not trying to win the marathon race. We're preparing for war. The Department of Defense, Indo-Pacific Command is literally preparing to go to war with China as we speak, right? This is not a competition. We're in a Cold War, and let's hope we keep it cold.
That is a perfectly clarifying way to end this episode. Dmitri, thank you for joining. The book is World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century.
Thanks so much, Marshall.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.